What happens when a handful of exhausted men, holding a single bridge deep in enemy territory, suddenly see the horizon darken with the approach of an entire German battalion? How do 10 soldiers stop 500? This is the story of a little-known action during the Battle of Schmidt, part of the longer, nightmarish Battle of Hürtgen Forest. In November 1944, Company L of the 112th Infantry Regiment, 28th Infantry Division, found itself cut off, surrounded, and facing annihilation. But at a critical crossing over the Kahl River, 10 men made a decision that would change the fate of their battalion. To understand what led these 10 men to that bridge, we have to go back to November 2nd, 1944. The 28th Infantry Division, the Keystone Division from Pennsylvania, had been given a daunting mission: seize the towns of Wassenach and Schmidt, deep in the dense, dark Hürtgen Forest. For the men of the 112th Infantry Regiment, the attack began with hope. They pushed through the thick fir trees, crossed the Kahl River, and by November 3rd, elements of the regiment actually reached the village of Schmidt. For a moment, victory seemed within reach. But the Germans, specifically the 89th Infantry Division and the 272nd Volksgrenadier Division, had no intention of giving up ground. They counterattacked with ferocity. By November 6th, the American positions in Schmidt and the nearby town of Kammerscheid were collapsing. Tanks were knocked out, company commanders were dead, and hundreds of American soldiers were trapped on the far side of the Kahl River, with the only way back to friendly lines being a single, exposed trail leading to a stone bridge deep in the ravine. The situation was desperate. German forces had flanked the American positions, and the survivors of the 112th Infantry, exhausted, low on ammunition, carrying their wounded, began a fighting withdrawal toward that bridge. They moved through the forest, harassed by sniper fire and mortar bursts that sent tree, branches, and shrapnel raining down. By late afternoon on November 6th, the first Americans reached the western edge of the Kahl River Gorge. But when they looked back, they saw the Germans closing in. If the enemy reached the bridge first, or captured it while American troops were still crossing, the entire battalion would be cut off and destroyed. That's when an officer, likely from Company L, made a decision. He selected 10 men, 10 riflemen. He gave them one order: hold the eastern approach to the Kahl Bridge. Hold it until every last American was across. Hold it even if it meant they would never cross themselves. These 10 men took up positions among the rocks and trees on the enemy side of the gorge. They had their M1 Garands, a few Browning automatic rifles, maybe a couple of grenades. They had no armor support, no artillery spotter, just the terrain and their own resolve. And then they saw them. Through the trees, moving with discipline, came the field gray uniforms of the German infantry. Not a patrol, not a squad. A full battalion, some 500 men, advancing toward the bridge. The 10 Americans opened fire. The first volley caught the Germans by surprise. Men dropped. The enemy column paused, seeking cover, trying to assess the strength of the force blocking their path. But the Germans were veterans. They quickly realized this was not a large unit holding them back. They began to spread out, attempting to flank the American position. For the 10 men, the situation was impossible. 500 against 10, 50 to 1 odds. Every minute they held, the Germans crept closer. Bullets snapped past their positions. Mortar rounds walked closer and closer. One of the Americans went down, then another. But they could not retreat. Behind them, their comrades were still crossing that bridge, wounded, men being carried on stretchers, exhausted soldiers helping each other up the far slope. What happened next would become the stuff of regimental legend. As the Germans prepared what should have been the final assault, the 10 Americans did something unexpected. They fixed bayonets. One of the sergeants, his name lost to history, though some records suggest it may have been a squad leader from Company L, shouted an order. And then, instead of waiting to be overrun, these few remaining men charged. They fired from the hip. They screamed. They ran straight at the German line. For a moment, the Germans hesitated. In the chaos of the forest, with dusk settling in, they could not tell how many Americans were coming at them. The sheer audacity of the attack broke their momentum. The German front rank wavered, then fell back, seeking cover from what they feared was a larger counterattack. That hesitation was all the time the Americans needed. Behind them, the last of the Battalions scrambled across the bridge and up the far side of the gorge. The crossing was secure. The battalion was saved. What happened to the 10 men? Some made it back across the bridge that night, slipping through the darkness as the Germans reorganized. Others were not so fortunate. The exact casualty count for this specific action was never recorded separately from the larger battle's toll, but we know that the 112th Infantry Regiment alone suffered over 2,000 casualties during the battle for Schmidt, including 431 men listed as missing in action, many of whom were never recovered. Some of those missing may well have been among the 10 who held the bridge that day. Men like Corporal Joseph Gunno of Company G, who was reported missing on November 9, 1944, and whose remains were only identified in 12/22/78, years after he gave his life in that forest. For decades, the story of the 10 men at the Call Bridge survived only in the memories of the survivors and in fragmentary, after-action reports. No Medal of Honor was awarded for this action. No Presidential Unit citation was given. But the men who crossed that bridge knew. They knew that, but for 10 soldiers who refused to retreat, the Battle of Schmidt would have ended in complete annihilation. The 28th Infantry Division would go on to fight in the Battle of the Bulge, just weeks later, where they would again face overwhelming odds. But the stand at the Call Bridge reminds us that in war, sometimes the difference between victory and defeat comes down to a handful of men who refuse to quit, even when the numbers say they don't stand a chance.